Well, hi everyone. This is certainly not the format that I expected or you expected, but my name is Tracy Kijewski-Correa. I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame and the director of the Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance Network. I was pleased to give my remarks today at the invitation of Keough, and I want to again express my gratitude for his invitation, but also my regrets. Unfortunately, I've tested positive for COVID and am symptomatic. As a result, I could not travel to be with you all today, and of course want to keep you safe. And thus I will ask for your grace as I move through this presentation, possibly with a little bit of interruption for my throat, to at least present my remarks and be with you, if at minimum in spirit. And my remarks today center on a problem that I care very deeply about, and so I appreciate the chance to use a digital platform to at least share my expressions or opinions on this matter. You know, we're seeing record-setting losses across this country related to weather and climate disasters. I think these NOAA graphics that were issued in the 2021 as shown here are a powerful reminder that things are changing in this country. And the record-setting losses that we're seeing, 95 billion in the year 2020 at the middle of the pandemic, kind of highlights what we're seeing. And with the continued migration toward our coasts, we're expecting these losses to only rise. In fact, the projected losses from hurricanes are expected by the year 2075 to outpace the U.S. economy's growth. So we've got a real issue in front of us. And we need to start understanding what is driving these changes. We need to understand how the exposure to hazards is influencing what we're seeing here, how the vulnerability of the inventory of buildings and infrastructure in this country is contributing, how the regulatory context that we've developed to keep us safe is actually not working any longer, how the information channels that we share risk information through are perhaps being ineffective, and how we're not aligning the appropriate incentive structures to get people to act and to mitigate their risks. So natural hazard events create an important starting point in what I like to call the data to knowledge life cycle. These events are tragic, but they're an important time to learn. And that learning begins with going out to the field to make direct observation in the most authentic laboratory we have, the real world itself, of the effect of these events on our communities. Now, traditionally, that would feed into research and development. We would find things that need to be addressed and new problems and questions that need to be solved, and those would feed in. New discoveries would naturally then follow through and go through the channels that exist in our society to reach that community someday. Often, that's through our regulatory mechanisms. But this is the cycle we normally take to learn from disaster. And unfortunately, this cycle is very slow. So when the National Science Foundation started to make investments in these extreme events reconnaissance networks, these coordinated response mechanisms for disaster events, the hope was that we could help improve the quality of what happens along this cycle, and in my eyes, as the director of one of these efforts, speed it up. Find ways through partnerships and our direct involvement to move information back to affected communities in time for them to use it to build back better. More effectively tell researchers what they should be working on and looking at to truly close the loop much faster. And find fast tracks to change the way we build our policies and practices. Instead of taking what can be an onerous cycle around this loop, try to speed those kinds of changes into communities and into regulatory processes at a pace that's consistent with the pace at which they naturally have to recover. So in figuring out how we were going to do this, how we're going to speed up that loop and make it more effective, we took the following approach, and I'll be talking today about the work of the organization I lead, which is called STEER. It's the Structural Extreme Events Reconnaissance Network. As the name suggests, we look at the impacts on the built environment, on structures. And so our approach had three facets. We first wanted to focus on capacity building. We need to help our community get better trained to do this work impactfully by creating, most importantly, standards for how this data would be collected. We wanted then to get ahead of everyone on coordination. How can we get out there early, efficiently, and in a way that we can have the maximum impact when these events occur? And third, we wanted to think about innovative ways to collaborate with one another. How can we use collaboration and broad engagement, not only researchers, but practitioners and policymakers, to really accelerate how fast we can learn from these events? So under the three pillars of these kinds of structural changes we implemented in the way field reconnaissance is conducted, we set forth to make some outcomes that were unique, The data wasn't going to hang out on someone's computer or hard drive anymore or on paper. It was going to be digital. It's going to be high quality. It's going to be communal. So it's going to be shared with everybody who wants it through an open platform so it can have broad impact and use. Second, we want to make sure that there is a rapid synthesis of what we learned from that event so we can move it out quickly to affected communities, so we can spur research and policy and practice. So we needed knowledge synthesis mechanisms. And third, we had to make sure that what we did was done in a timely, reliable fashion, and again, was accessible to all. So with that kind of very community-centered approach, very different than traditional academic research, we set out to start operationalizing this organization. And we were fortunate to be able to learn from and work with all of the hazards in this endeavor, from our windstorms like hurricanes and tornadoes to our colleagues working on earthquakes and tsunamis, and our storm surge colleagues who work in our hurricane responses. We got all the hazards under one umbrella so we could start making advances to serve them all and to learn from all their vast experience. So when we started to build STEER, it was operationalized just through a pilot in the 2017 hurricane season. So Harvey, Irma, Maria, right? That was our first kind of pilot of this all. NSF liked what they saw, so they invested in a cycle of design and version 1 operations. That's what's shown in green. So that ran from 2018 to 2020. And by late 2020, we had secured our follow-on grant to continue to build out the organization. And that, and that kind of allowed us then to start our next cycle of design and operations. And we're kind of concluding our first full year in that cycle. So all in total, we've been able to respond to almost 4 dozen hazard events. We've produced dozens of briefings and reports on those events. We've collected over 29,000 assessments in our mobile apps of different buildings and infrastructure, and engaged in that process over 200 different individuals on our teams, many of whom had never actually collaborated before, which is kind of a crazy idea. And in fact, 200 people have been involved, over 200 in our work, but we have a pool of almost 400 people sitting in reserve waiting to be engaged when their expertise and their time and availability can be of benefit. And so this kind of pool of people is mobilized at any moment through our tiered response system. And this is kind of how the sausage is made. In other words, how we get all these people moving together in a coherent way to accomplish this work. So the idea begins first with an event, right? So our tiered response starts with an event, and immediately we mobilize what's called a virtual assessment structural team. The acronym is VAST, V-A-S-T. These are virtual responders. And I want to say that this was an under-leveraged, in our opinion, part of field reconnaissance in our community, particularly, in the wind community. And so by having these virtual assessors ready and on hand, they could start participating in a more flexible way from their homes to gather all the preliminary data we could find on the event and build that first kind of intelligence report, if you will. That's called our preliminary virtual reconnaissance report, 100% virtual. It's called the PVRR, and we issue that as quickly as possible right after the event. That's going to give us a lot of understanding about what is going on in that event and how we should phase our next levels of response, if any, right? Some events just stop at virtual. But for the ones that have something to learn from, we will then operationalize a second response, which is our field team. So the first field teams start going out. The field assessment structural team, we call it the FAST. That's going to go out into the field, and it's going to usually now in our first wave of field response be a smaller scouting mission. We really want to get out there early and get a wide canvas of what happened in the event to inform follow-on action. So that first, maybe smaller, more agile scout team will go out, usually regional in nature, close to the event. They're going to go get that data right away and issue this early access reconnaissance report, what we call the EARR. That's our first field observations. And then that's going to spin out, possibly, if we see a chance to learn even further, additional field teams that would follow up with real targets then. We know exactly where to send them, what hypotheses we have that are worth looking into further, which case studies we want to develop forensically and do an in-depth assessment. So that second team might roll out after that. Again, the decision to go up to any one of these 3 tiers, green to orange to blue, is dependent on what we're seeing in that event. So we won't go all the way up to all 3 for all events, but it gives us some flexibility in phasing up or down our response based on what we're learning along the way. And as that data is being collected, then we're going to feed it into the back end shown in purple, where we have data librarians who are conducting a quality control and enrichment process to populate the records and get them ready for long-term archiving. And that's when the final data sets are released. Now, even though that process can take weeks to months to conclude, We make all of our data available in real time through some of the platforms I'm going to show you shortly. And that enables us to allow people to get their hands on it and make use of it even while all that, work is still unfolding. I will add that although we have about almost 400 approved members whose locations are shown on the map here, we have actually over 700 people who actually actively use our mobile apps, which I'll show shortly, just indicating that the uptake of Steer's approach and its data is well beyond its involved members, and I'm particularly proud in noting that fact. So when we take a look at getting our teams ready to deploy, as we're deciding and putting a field team out there and trying to phase them up along this escalation chart, we're really trying to think about what types of responses make the most sense, what types of missions or surveys. So, traditionally, if we're looking especially at a lot of our wind-based hazards, these hazard gradient surveys tend to be one of the mission designs we deploy commonly. You can see it here for Michael, and you can see it for the Nashville tornadoes on the top left and right. We basically have our teams working along the gradient of that hazard to either capture the full path of the tornado or in a hurricane to move along the gradient of the storm surge or the wind speed. And that would give us the sampling of performance that lets us look at the correlations between performance and the level of hazard intensity. Now, in some cases, we don't have the ability to work that gradient. In the case of the Palu tsunami, and this is what we would call a representative performance study, you don't have time to go and do a gradient. You've actually got to get in there and get a representative observation from different classes of structures or in different geographies, because you only have a little time on the ground in a very dire situation. So the Palu case study was more, the Palu example is more of a case study based approach. And those case studies were done at a fairly high level. In Puerto Rico, more time on the ground, more stable conditions, and a lot of pre-arrival intelligence about certain buildings allowed that type of approach to be done much more deeply. So those case studies were more targeted and rich. This one was done with the Bloom Center at Stanford. And so you can, imagine us phasing up the second level of responses accordingly based on our time on the ground and the level of information we have about those structures. And then the response types in the bottom row with the green tags are the ones that I actually am very fond of now because they've become the operating template or model for the way we're going forward. Put a smaller scout team out first, let them get critical intelligence and understand access and safety, send that information back, and follow up with a second wave of response. In the case of Hurricane Dorian, that was the way we approached it due to an opportunity of how to get to the islands at a very challenging time. So we phased that investigation and it essentially became a template for that model I showed you on the previous slide. Then when we looked at Hurricane Laura, it was another example of phased, but it emphasized for us the real value of using the Street View type of technologies, which I'm going to show you shortly. This ability to rapidly image a community in that first pass with the scout team is so valuable, in this case in a pandemic. We couldn't send our field teams out door to door interacting with people. Instead, what we had to do was keep people in cars in isolation in their bubble, collecting data from their car, and then feeding that actually to virtual teams working safely in their homes who would interrogate that data and conduct the more thorough structural assessment. Seeing the efficacy of that model in Laura gave us a lot of hope for how we could actually better use our virtual assessors and many rich data collection platforms that I'm about to show you shortly to really do this work in more efficient and more inclusive ways. So when we go out on these missions, very much the type of mission we pick, our time on the ground, and our goals will dictate the kind of hardware we deploy. I will say that in every mission, and especially, in the more targeted and in-depth assessments, we're always going to be using our mobile apps to do performance assessments. You can see an example of someone using that app, and that's a human-in-the-loop assessment. When we're doing these field teams that are going out to scout in that first wave of field response, we're really relying on this technique here in the bottom corner, the bottom left. That's our Streetlevel 360 imaging platforms. This one's from the Rapid facility at Washington. Camera strapped to cars, drive the car. Essentially gives you the street view imagery that you're used to seeing in Google. So we can pick that kind of imagery up very efficiently. And when possible, we'd love to get overhead with unmanned aerial systems to complement that from above. At the times where we really want to do that more targeted case study, we can come back with, various forms of, scanning technologies and do some really nice in-depth recreations and capture of perishable data. that allows you to develop a full three-dimensional model to interoperate with and examine. And we'll do that for case studies because this is a very intensive method. But again, you get this preservation of a critical failure and the ability forensically to relive it and analyze it more richly. And there was a great example of that after Hurricane Michael between STEER colleagues and the RAPID facility. But really, that street level imaging platform, in my opinion, is going to be the game changer for a number of reasons, not only for post-event assessment, but as I'll show you later in the talk, pre-event baselining and inventory development. So if we take a look here, I'm just going to show you an example of how these platforms provide and serve up this data in an effective way. This is the mapillary interface for our Mayfield tornado data. You can see all the routes our cars drove during that mission. And then if you click on any of these, pins to kind of pick your starting point, you'll come into Mayfield, and now you're reliving Mayfield. So as we kind of bring up the image and work with it, and I can minimize that to make it more clear, you can actually, move forward and literally walk the streets. And this captures that moment in time. It captures, the damage that was observed. You can then zoom in and see particular structures in more detail, as you can see here. And I can turn and kind of pan around and get a complete appreciation for what happened in that event and the preservation of what that town looked like after these historic, quad state tornado sequence. So this is a really powerful tool for, I would argue, preservation, but it has allowed our virtual assessors and our teams to recreate and revisit an event and see much more rich detail than they would have had the time to absorb during their limited and often stressful period on the ground. So we really see this as an important preservation and rapid access tool for our work, and something that I think we're going to be committed to using even more expansively going forward. Now, it is not going to replace, it is a natural complement to what I consider the staple of our responses, and that's our mobile app. The mobile apps have made it possible to reduce user error, standardize, and streamline the way we collect this data so it can be available immediately. And the idea behind this is using our mobile apps in the Fulcrum platform. You can see a screenshot here. We are able to let our surveyors create a record at any time. It becomes a pin, and then attached to that pin is a lot of rich information. They are able to upload detailed photographs from all sides of the structure, record audio stepping through their impressions and dictating, record notes as free field text. They are then stepped through a series of standard data fields where they're providing responses to allow us to classify the components and building use and the performance of those various components on standard damage rating scales. All of these then feed into a central geolocated kind of database. So those pins are geolocated and georeferenced. That allows us to export this out in any variety of formats, Excel, GeoJSON, anything you want. And each of those pins now is enriched with all this valuable data. So it has a beautiful, app-based interface in the field and a powerful backend at the desktop. Now, because we know our assessors are incredibly stressed and strapped when they're in the field, and that's valuable time, in our mission designs, we also build up base maps that get all their targets aligned for them. We will pick clusters or areas where they might focus their attention and do a particular survey, or we might find case study buildings for them and flag them. No matter what the mission design, we feel these pre-populated maps with targets allow our users to be more effective in their missions, and these can be cached out and loaded into their Fulcrum interface. So as a result, you have the ability to preload all of that, and that is able to make sure that they have all that data available, cached on their phone, and they're able to see their position relative to those targets. Now, when they're moving into these clusters, an area where we have a lot of structures of interest and we want to kind of look at performance across different ages of construction or construction types, we'll often have them execute a mixed methodological survey in that cluster. The idea here is that they would want to create an unbiased sample of all the buildings in that cluster. So they would go door to door and literally either assess every building, usually we do every third for efficiency. Then we have an unbiased sample performance appropriate to use to generate things like fragilities. As they're doing the door-to-door assessment, where all these little pins are popping up using their mobile app, we've got someone driving cars with those street-level cameras, and they're building out those panoramas. And then overhead, we can be using our unmanned aerial systems to capture imagery that can be used to create those structure from motion models to do the recreation of that community from above. And that gives us then 3 very valuable sources of data that we can bring together to do a comprehensive assessment once we return home. Now, those apps that I talked about that are used in the door-to-door assessment, they are exceptionally rich. They have over 100 fields, and the reason for this is allowing us to do a very in-depth evaluation then of the potential drivers of the performance we're observing. As a result, they generate a vast array of building information and attributes, structural details about component and subassembly details, and then of course the damage of all of those components under different hazard loadings. Now this is a lot to complete in the field, and it would really slow you down. So what we've done is actually automated the process such that a number of fields in green are pre-populated by the app. A number of fields are flagged in red or orange as either priorities or absolute requirements for our field teams, and that is mostly focused on the media, the photos, the videos, etc., and some of the up-close structural details and hazard information. Then the rest of the information can actually be answered by a structural assessment team working virtually. So everything you see with the purple boxes around it, our field teams don't have to worry about, because someone working at the back end is able to populate all of that information for them. And the way we do this is making a vast array of critical data available to our virtual teams. Much more information than you and I could possibly ever navigate or manage from our phones in the middle of a disaster response. So those virtual teams are sitting back home on their desktop interacting with the Fulcrum database, seeing the location of that damage and the information coming in from the field, including photos. They are able to pull up available aerial imagery, some of that freely distributed from folks like NOAA after major hurricanes. They are able to scrape the parcel data records, if available, from the local providers like a tax assessor, for example, pull building permits, see how that structure was constructed. And as that data is coming in, let's say from the rapid facility, giving those street level panoramas, they can get context around the building, zoom in and out on the site, and they can even get overhead using the structure from motion models. So with all of this in kind of combination, they have a rich array of data to interrogate, to complete those remaining fields and build out each record, truly enriching it beyond what you could do as just a single assessor out there with your phone. Now, once they've built up all of that rich information, we have to think about how we move it out to people in efficient ways. What I first want to emphasize is the top 2 platforms you see on this slide are real-time platforms, beginning first with our Fulcrum community that any of you can join right now and have access to our data. These are synchronizing literally as our field assessors have mobile connectivity, so you are seeing their work as it unfolds in real time. And similarly, as our street level panoramas are ready and processed into the system, we are loading them into Mapillary and Google Street View, giving us a way to share that immediately with individuals responding on the ground or collecting further data. Mapillary is now our preferred platform, as you can see from the example I showed in Mayfield, and it has some really nice features that we are now taking even further advantage of. Now, when we talk about long-term preservation, everything that we've done is also cached out of these platforms and into NARI's Design Safe, run out of the University of Texas. We can build out these detailed projects that include the full quality control data set for archival preservation in case these 2 platforms above should happen to go away. And in addition, all the reports and other briefings that we create for STEER are also permanently archived on Design Safe, so that you have those always for reference. Now, as we started to build up this kind of rich data, one of the first things that comes to mind is like, how can we use it to improve the fragilities that are used in loss modeling methodologies? Because we have so many rich fields on building attributes and component level performance of the structure, there's a real opportunity to use STEER data to advance our loss modeling capabilities. And so we started actually to work on that in collaboration with the NARI Sim Center. The Sim Center was creating these workflows, these computational open source workflows to do the simulation of losses down at the individual building footprint or parcel level. Here we can see the expected damage and loss ratios for Hurricane Laura in Lake Charles. These were generated taking a HAZUS-based methodology, but scaling it all the way down to individual buildings. So all of a sudden, there's this chance to validate what they were seeing in the Sim Center against the data that STEER was collecting. Now, as the Sim Center was diving into this whole process of building out these loss models, and I work on the team that is doing that piece as well, One of the big challenges we faced in building out these models is generating the building inventories needed to feed into a hazards-based loss estimation approach. The reality is not every community has the data necessary to actually characterize the buildings and run them through the loss estimation. Critical things like the number of stories or the year built are frankly just not reported or reported with accuracy. So a big part of the lift that we've been doing on the backside by the Sim Center is actually trying to find ways to generate that inventory data in places where it's missing, taking on the parcel data where available, but even using things like the information reported on real estate websites like Zillow to complement and enrich the data, particularly when it's missing. And machine learning is turning into a very valuable tool to take those data sources and really expand their potential. One of the other areas that we found to be exceptionally helpful is using that street level panoramic data. STEER is collecting that post-event. It's available pre-event on Google. And as you can see, using computer vision techniques, this little carousel of images shows you that you can start extracting out the number of stories, the height of floors, the locations of doors and windows, the types of foundation, even the types of roof cover and wall cover. So all of a sudden you can set loose a computer in classifying much of the information humans used to have to provide in order to be able to generate not just representations of those buildings for loss modeling, but even in cataloging the kind of information needed for our STEER assessments, where so much of that is based on just the building characteristics and context of the site. So now that the Sim Center had all these tools to augment the parcel data and generate building inventories to generate this kind of rich description of damage and loss, the million-dollar question is, are we getting it right? And so now that you take a hazards-based methodology and you push it down to parcel level, you can see how well it does actually capture what an individual building is experiencing. Now in the plots I'm showing you here, we have the simulated damage states on the hazards 5-point damage scale that were simulated using the Sim Center's workflow. And on the bottom you have the STEER damage states rated by our assessors. If things are working, these fall on the dashed black line as a 45-degree 1-to-1 match. As you can see, there's a lot of variability, so a number of observations for each damage state. And more importantly, you can see error bars around these. This is because the estimation of losses in our Sim Center workflow is very much dependent on the year of construction. It dictates the likely construction practices and the building code used for that building. Knowing that that had a lot of uncertainty, we propagated that uncertainty through the model to put error bars on these estimates and get an appreciation of its impact. Well, as you can see here, then the average of those estimates, of those observations, is shown on the red line. And you can see that for the modest damage states, the minor to moderate damage, we do well, but the more extreme states are not captured as are issues with the undamaged state. So all of a sudden we start to see that there are some issues. One question we had is because our model assumed people shuttered their windows, and STEER noticed that many in Louisiana had not pre-LoRa. Was that a reason for the discrepancies? Well, when we adjust the rule sets within the loss estimation workflow to capture the fact that there wasn't good shuttering compliance, we do see that some of the damage states actually start to align better, but we still are not accurately capturing the majority of damage states, telling us there's something else wrong here. Now, this shouldn't be surprising, right? A hazards-based loss estimation was meant to give aggregate losses over, entire census blocks, and now we're pushing it down to individual structures where there's a high rate of variability in how that structure was built and how the hazards manifested at that site. Long story short, having rich data from organizations like STEER collected after events will give us the ability to now find out what's driving these discrepancies and build out more high-fidelity loss estimation techniques that can give communities a more reliable expectation of the risks they face. And that takes me to my closing comments here. We've got to remember that there are humans in the loop, and there are real barriers and drivers of their choice to take mitigation actions or not. We can give them improved risk information, and we'll do our best to get these plots to be more representative of the hazards they face and the risks as they manifest. But the problem is people don't adopt them, and we've got to find out why people don't act on risk information. But we have real potentials now with all of the open data I've shown you today and all of the kind of efforts of STEER and the Sim Center to do more targeted, real-time assessment of humans' reactions and recovery responses after major events. That will allow us to do more targeted household surveys at the same time we're doing all this other important data collection, allowing us to baseline and then even post-event evaluate how humans and the built environment are interacting together in these events. And we've been building indices that allow us to estimate and help homeowners evaluate their level of vulnerability to these hazards, the level of actions that they are taking in retrofitting and recovery, and their intentions to remodel and retrofit going forward. By building these kinds of rich indices and now being able to populate them not only with the physical observations of their built environment as generated by STEER or simulated by the Sim Center and their own self-reported experiences and decisions, we're able to actually make much greater headway on understanding why people uptake or do not the mitigation guidance and risk information we're communicating. We are actually piloting this more expansive and integrated data collection scheme in Lake Charles right now for the purposes of studying the recovery actions after Hurricane Laura. We're able to use all the Street View data that STEER's already collected and the assessments at all the locations on the black dots to really reconstruct what happened and then be able to fuse that with how humans in turn responded. And the ability to bring all the rich inventory data and loss estimations coming from the Sim Center will allow us to correlate that with the years of construction and additions of code governing those structures to understand where the regulatory system worked or did not in governing those actions. Because if we're going to stem the mounting losses of disaster, we will have to find ways to integrate field observations to drive these critical learning loops. And that means we need to be able to highlight not only the research needs that we can see from that data, but opportunities to truly intervene and change the way communities build. We must run these loops efficiently and in a reliable manner if we ever mean to get data out to communities in time for them to build back better. And that rapid dissemination is key. I hope you can see the commitments we've made through STEER to take important measures in that direction. But we'll never be able to truly close the loop and bring it full circle unless we keep humans in the loop. And we're really excited about these new pilots in Lake Charles as a way to actually bring them much closer and use this data truly in service to society. So with that, I thank you. I acknowledge all the rich collaborations that are a part of this important work. And again, my regrets for not being able to be with you all today.
Tracy, thank you. It's a very comprehensive presentation, an excellent presentation, explaining how all of this is going to come together and the technology that is used to assemble the information that will be useful for the future. But just enough time for a couple of questions. And one of the questions I had is, so how do you see how we can influence the professional practice with this?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think first of all, we have found already that practice is very keen to have access to our data. And we've seen firms already starting to use it as they develop their own loss modeling strategies. Our friends at Simpson Strong-Tie, for example, really appreciate this ability to not only see the validation of some of their technology in the field, but actually go on our missions and bring rich experience. So I just do think that for us as natural hazards practitioners, Mother Nature is the ultimate laboratory. And as much as we have outstanding full-scale testing that has been done at places like Texas Tech, being able to do that kind of real-world simulation with all the imperfections of man's, construction technologies and nature's, uncertainties, it's just for us the ultimate laboratory. So in short, I think they really appreciate that validation, and they're also appreciating the chance to use that data in their companies, and more importantly, to actually contribute to gathering the data and bringing their forensic insights.
Yeah, and so continue on that one. And we also want to go forward and influence the policymaker.
Yeah.
Down the road. And do you just give us your view of how we go about doing that?
That is the hardest one. I'll be 100% candid in the reason why we're doing a lot more human subjects work now with real stakeholders. In a nutshell, there have not been many successful ways of helping people understand how to build back better or why they should invest in a far-off threat like a hazard when they have other pressing things on their kitchen table, if you will. So one of the things we're looking at right now is how to create better incentives. A few things we've seen where policy can make impact. Right now, families don't see a return on their mitigation investment. If you upgrade your business or home, it doesn't reflect in the real estate values tomorrow, even though it might save you in 10 or 50 years when that tornado or hurricane strikes. So what we can do, first of all, is in our policy framework, we can reward mitigation. more actively today. So when a family or a business sees a 2-for-1, I upgrade and I'm safer tomorrow. I upgrade and I can sell this on the market tomorrow as well and see a more immediate return on investment. I'd love to get to a day where we are valuing mitigation investment the same way we value a granite countertop or a spacious lobby. And so we're really trying to apply pressure both in real estate industry to market mitigation as a positive and reward it with increased market value. And I think policymakers can think of creative ways to disclose mitigation in lending, purchasing, and real estate transactions. So again, we are celebrating it as we're doing with LEED and green building technology. And that's what I'd love to see us do next.
Yeah, and then so what you have done is, collaborating with a lot of different people and putting this in a visual sense. And I think that ultimately that may have an impact as we start showing visually just what it was there before and what has happened now, and that we're missing it.
Yeah.
Any comments on the visual aspect of it?
Well, one thing, it brings it home, right, in a real meaningful way because it captures it. Another thing we're looking at in Lake Charles is what's called the near miss family. One of the questions we have is if your neighbor was just destroyed, maybe you were spared. What are you thinking after that? Are you starting to voluntarily upgrade and get ahead of the next hurricane season because of what just happened next door? And that's why we're collecting evidence on both how impacted families are recovering and what they're thinking and how our data can help open their eyes, but also the near misses. If we find out the near misses are primed to hear mitigation messages, then we should be hitting them as hard as we're hitting those rebuilding with the right ways to bring their home not only up to code, but above code, as we're seeing IBHS and others, propagate or advocate. So I'm really hopeful for that part, especially that this becomes really tangible and we find new ways to seize those windows after hurricanes to get these messages out in really visual and impactful ways.
Excellent, Tracy. And I wish you best in getting better very soon.